I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Tasha and Elizabeth, for agreeing to doing this. This is so, so good of you. I don't know if everybody knows on the call, but this is one of a few alumni career conversations that we're going to be having over the next month or so. So it's great for you guys to be here. This one in particular is on finance, but there will be others on other different topics within career education. So that'll be great. Before we get started, for those who are on the call, I just wanted to give you a couple of the norms. I put it in the chat, but in case you didn't see it, just keep yourselves muted. As far as agenda, we're gonna ask the ladies a few questions in the beginning, and then towards the back half, we'll go ahead and open it up for everybody to ask questions. And whether you wanna put it in the chat box and put the question there, or raise your hand and do it, we could do it that way too. So either would work. But at the beginning, we're just gonna keep it kind of simple. And this is being recorded, just so you all know. Okay. So with that being said, I didn't want to steal your thunder. I'm just going to quickly introduce you, and you guys go ahead and then you can introduce yourselves. But like I said, it's Tasha Begg and Elizabeth Morgan, and they're both have been very gracious in accepting this offer to join us and to talk about their career journey. Many of you on the call know that I always say that careers are rarely linear. They're usually very curvy and windy, and there's all good pieces in there. So I'm hoping that everybody will be inspired by your two paths and just, enjoy the journey. So with that, I'll leave it to you guys. So either one can start. I was going to say, if you want to introduce yourself, name, major, what year you are, what you loved about Wellesley, or a favorite teacher or something, take it. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Hilda. Tasha, do you want to go first, or do you want me?
No, you can go.
Okay. So I am Elizabeth Morgan, and very happy to be speaking with you all tonight. Tasha and I were the same year from Wellesley. We were the class of 2013. I actually finished my degree a semester early, so I finished in December of 2012 and moved back home to New York. I grew up in Manhattan. And while I was I had AP credits from high school. I did a winter session in Rome while at Wellesley. I studied abroad in Bologna. I took advantage of the cross-registration. So I took an accounting class at Babson, another class at MIT. And through that, I was just able to finish early. I was an American Studies major, so have very fond memories of Professor Jeffries. For any American Studies majors out there, I took an incredible, a few classes with him, but one very interesting seminar on Obama. And I think what was most interesting about that was looking at the ways he really galvanized a grassroots movement and really inspired people to action. And so I've always been kind of fascinated on how to motivate people, and my kind of in a similar vein, my favorite course probably at Wellesley is a psychology class that I took with Professor Carley, and it was organizational psychology. And it really, I found it to be incredibly useful in my working career, because we spent a lot of time looking at how to manage and motivate employees, what kind of the physical space, how that can impact your ability to work. We talked a lot about gender biases, and she has this theory that it's not the glass ceiling, but it's a glass labyrinth. So trying to navigate challenges that women face in the workforce, how to prepare for negotiations going in, and kind of thinking about negotiation tactics, group thing versus individual thing. So a lot of really applicable things that I find myself constantly thinking about even now. In terms of, I think one of your questions had been kind of what drew me to Wellesley in the first place, or you'd asked about that. I was drawn to Wellesley kind of 3 A's: the alums, the academics, and then access to Boston. And being from New York, I liked that I wasn't too far. But ultimately, when I was deciding on colleges, I was debating between Middlebury, which is in Middlebury, Vermont, and Wellesley. And I felt, even though Wellesley was all women's, an all women's school, which I loved, I'd be exposed to a greater pool of people being near Boston. And it was actually, Wellesley was the first school that I visited ever. I visited my sophomore year of high school. an elementary school math teacher is an alum, and she and her twin sister both went to Wellesley and were raving about it since I was like, I don't know, 12 years old. So I'd always heard about it, went to the campus, loved it. And also I was drawn to the academics, which I felt would be a very pure environment. In terms of my kind of, should I go into my career journey or kind of pause there?
Pause there.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh my gosh, Bitsy, you're so eloquent. I feel like this will be a juxtaposition of speaking styles and career trajectory, so I feel like this will be really good for you guys. So I'm Tasha Beg, again, class of 2013, economics, Middle Eastern studies, double major. So, I mean, you know, it's so hard to pick a favorite professor, I think, from the economics program. I think it's really a rigorous curriculum, but I think what really is super memorable, just, you know, the quality of professors and how they interact with you. So, you know, shout out to Keela, shout out to Robin McKnight, even Casey Rothschild, who was new when I was there, but, you know, taught like a really, really tough intermediate micro class. So good luck with all of that. But you guys are all seniors, so I'm sure, you know, if you are an econ major, you're long past that. I'm actually originally from Malaysia. I moved to the States when I was 14, so just in time for high school. And how I picked Wellesley was kind of really practical, and it's so sad. I wish I had a better story almost. But, you know, I was looking at top liberal arts schools that, you know, I felt would give me a strong quality of education and would also give me the most scholarship money, to be quite frank. And so Wellesley, you know, really came through for me, and it was actually a cheaper option for me to go to Wellesley versus going to University of Texas, Austin in-state tuition, which says something a lot about the, you know, the endowment and how well it's managed, and, you know, how great the alum base is and donations and all that. I'm trying to think of what else I can say. I mean, you know, I feel like a lot of my story is very similar to, you know, Bitsy. We didn't necessarily may have had the most traditional finance backgrounds. I mean, I know I was an economics major, but if you knew me in college, I was not the best economics student, I would say. You know, I loved my Middle Eastern studies major. I would argue that was my passion major, and economics was a very rational decision, my mom would say. But, you know, ultimately, like, I think, you know, I'm right where I want to be career wise, and, you know, I'm so excited to kind of share with you the trajectories. So I do have one request, though. If you do raise your hand or do ask a question, you know, I would love to see your faces. So, you know, please, if you want to take your video off, I know I tried to look a little better for this call. So, but anyway, nice to meet you guys.
That's a good point. Yeah, if you guys want to show your video, that'd be great. I think when you do ask questions, that will have a prompt to do that. Why don't we then, Tasha, why don't we keep going with you? Tell us your story, your career journey.
Sure.
Maybe start with like what you did at Wellesley, like internship or fellowships or volunteer work, things that you did and how it culminated, you graduated and then going into your career.
Sure. So, you know, what's funny is I guess when I started Wellesley, I was very determined to be pre-med, which I feel like everyone is for the most part. And then I realized after first semester, that was not the direction I wanted to head in. I wasn't really sure what to do. Economics seemed like a great idea, but I had no idea how to really sort of make that a tangible career option. Really, like I'm first generation. My parents didn't go to college. My parents actually didn't even really finish high school, and so I didn't really have that exposure to finance or like all these other types of jobs that, you know, when you go to college, that's like, oh, I want to be an investment banker. Like, that totally was not me at all. I actually got exposed to it through, funnily enough, a person I was dating at the time at MIT, and he had talked extensively about, you know, his internships at Credit Suisse and whatnot in sales and trading. And he made a comment once being like, oh, you know, it's really hard to get a Wall Street job. And I, being a typical Wellesley woman, I feel like when I don't know how hard that could be, I'm going to give it a go anyway. And you know what? I actually managed to get a Morgan Stanley institutional sales and trading internship my sophomore year. It was a program that was available at the time to encourage more women in finance. So, I thought, let me try a summer paid internship, see how I like it. What's funny was I actually didn't enjoy sales and trading as much as I thought I would, but I met enough people, to talk me into doing something like investment.
We can't hear you, Tasha. Did you? We lost you. I think you're back.
Am I back? Am I good?
Keep going.
Sorry. I don't know what happened. Nothing really moved. Anyway, I was saying I got exposure to investment banking through some folks I met that summer, and I thought it was another great opportunity to kind of explore another facet in finance. So I actually did end up interviewing for a full-time job at Deutsche Bank in the healthcare banking division, which is where I spent my first 2 years out of college. And that's kind of a very confusing time for a lot of people, and myself included. I didn't really know if banking was something I wanted to do long term. And I feel like, for those on the phone who have banking offers, I'm sure you're sort of mentally prepared that it is very strenuous, it is very tough, and I'm happy to talk about that, later in this conversation. But for me, I knew it wasn't something that was meant for me, and I wanted to explore more client-facing nature of the business. And so right after investment banking, I actually ended up at a hedge fund called Scopia, where I did investor relations for about 2.5 to almost 3 years. And at the time, I really didn't have any idea what hedge funds were, much less what, investor relations really entailed. No one really talks to you about these roles in college, and they're not really feeder opportunities. And I felt very fortunate almost to be included in this exclusive club almost of investor relations, and being that face of a company and raising money and talking to investors. And that was sort of what I really thrived on. But fast forward 2.5 years, I kind of got a little settled and content in my career. It felt more like a place where I thought I could maybe spend, if I were 10 years older with kids potentially, it would be the best place for me, because it had great lifestyle balance, and the work was interesting enough, but I felt like I was still super young in my career, and I really, really wanted to explore, again, just different avenues in finance. So at that point, the 2.5 year mark, I started interviewing, and I ended up getting a job at UBS in their asset management division as a product specialist, and specifically being a product specialist for their fund of funds, which is a fund of hedge funds. So instead of working for one hedge fund, I now kind of oversaw a lot of our investments in multiple hedge funds, which meant, understanding various strategies, understanding sort of market dynamics, understanding which strategies play well with a market cycle. And so I thought that was really, really interesting. And honestly, I probably would have stayed there for a lot longer, but funnily enough, a connection that I had made back at Morgan Stanley when I was a junior in college resurfaced, and we got coffee, and we'd stayed in touch through all these years. And he actually worked across the street from me, which was at Neuberger Berman, and he had suggested, hey, the team is looking for someone to really kind of, be that point person and take charge, and we think you'd be a really good fit. And so even though it was a very short year at UBS, I actually got an offer at Neuberger, and which is where I am right now, all thanks to a mentor of mine that I met way back in my junior year. So don't sleep on your mentors, or anyone you network with, because you never know how they're going to come into play. And so my role now at Neuberger is within the institutional client group. I know I'm also throwing a lot of terms out. So again, if you want clarification, please, there are no dumb questions whatsoever. It's just such common vernacular now that I don't even know what's not formal or not. But what I do is basically I sell product, similar to how a salesperson sells shoes to an individual. I sell product to institutional clients like pension funds, state pension funds, the Wellesley endowment. I sell financial product that would help grow their endowment, to help grow their pension. Yeah, so that's sort of my career trajectory. It's kind of all over the place. I'm very proud of it. At the same time, I know it's not as linear as, as Hilda mentioned earlier, linear as definitely not something I feel like a lot of folks might find in their careers, and definitely did not find me. But I feel like it's definitely given me a lot of experience and a lot of exposure, and I can speak, to all these different aspects in finance. And so, if you have any questions about anything at all, whether it's banking, sell side versus buy side, asset managers, hedge funds, fund of funds, I'm your woman.
Tasha, before we even switch over, here's one more question about your career journey.
Sure.
How do you think the different positions have sort of lent themselves to the next one?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like certain skills you kept taking with you that aggregated into sort of a newfound love, or how do you think that sort of evolved?
Sure. So, I think, as tough as it is for me to say, I feel like banking is, not to say like you can't get the career that I have, or, a great career if you don't start off in banking. And, that just happened to be my trajectory. But I felt like banking really provided me with this amazing foundation. And, I won't sugarcoat it. It was definitely a tough 2 years of my life of, no sleep, a lot of hours, a lot of sort of pitch books. It's very PTSD, but I do believe that ultimately, it did give me a foundation symbiotically, whether it's, I understand how to value a company from my own perspective. It's in my investment portfolio. It also taught me that I really enjoyed working with people in groups, because you have your deal teams and then you have other deal teams and you kind of work all together. And the aspect of the job that I love the most was putting together presentations, which I recognize is very weird. And also, sort of how I interacted with people. I thought those two qualities were something that I could really shine. And that's something that came through my reviews. And so in thinking of the next step and where I wanted to jump to, I thought it was important to pick something that really lent itself to both qualities. And investor relations, kind of was something that really, met the criteria. And honestly, I think it was the right decision for me. And even in investor relations, it's really funny, they want, even though it may seem on the surface level, like, let me talk to clients, and I'm sure, Bitsy can expand on it more in her current role, but there was an element of like, you still need to run analysis. You still need to be very thoughtful about how you present the analyses, your Excel skills, like up to par at a certain point. And it's funny, Excel is something that I feel like is super second nature to me now. And every job that I've jumped to, everyone has commented on my Excel skills. And, even if it's just a little shortcut that makes your sort of project go a lot faster, it is sort of a built-in skill now that I feel like is super crucial, I think, especially if you want to be in finance. And I hate to be technical, I'm not a technical person whatsoever, but it is very, very helpful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
I think it's tough too, because, obviously Wellesley, it's not like we're dealing with a ton of Excel modeling or anything really. And if you're a pure liberal arts major, you're, going to be spending most of your time writing papers, and people do appreciate that skill. That is a very value add. But to equal the playing field with sort of competitors from other colleges who may have had like a formalized finance training, that Excel sort of understanding and like willingness to get up to speed is really, really critical, I think.
Yeah, fair enough. I was going to say lots of people learn along the way, but if you don't have that opportunity, you do need to equalize it at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for sharing. That was wonderful. Elizabeth, would you like to take it away?
Yes. So this will be a good dichotomy, because I kind of landed in my investor relations role now through a very non-traditional path. But while we're on the topic of Excel, I would definitely second that and put a plug in that if you find yourself with free time, try and find an Excel crash course or training, or Microsoft has like training modules that you can go through. There's also, some Wall Street prep classes. And usually if you're getting a banking job or another job, they'll give you like a week of training or something. Lindsay Goldberg did it when I joined. And so that's tremendously helpful. But any time you put in now to kind of get your Excel skills up to par, at least build some sort of foundation. So when you do go through that crash course, will be tremendously helpful. And that's something that I wish that I had, that I wish that I were better at now, and I did not get because I didn't go through a traditional investment banking path. So I'll kind of rewind now and share a bit about my experience. So while I was at Wellesley, I was a little bit late to the internship game. My junior summer, I interned. Well, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was, as I said, an American Studies major. I was thinking about media, and I, knew I enjoyed reading and writing, and I ended up interning at NBC Universal and Condé Nast. I kind of did a couple days a week at each firm over that summer, and I loved them both, and it was a lot of fun, but they were both unpaid internships, and I was living at home and very conscious of the fact that the only reason why I could accept an unpaid internship was because I didn't have to pay for housing or any of that. And I felt, this was fun, and I could see myself doing this, but I also know that this is not going to pay off the way that I want to. And I also didn't find it as, I want to say, kind of engaging in the way that I was hoping, whereas all my friends who were kind of interning in finance or were kind of telling me about the stock pitch that they'd given, or like following the news. And I felt like I wanted something that was a little more involved. But I also had always thought about law school. So and one thing I wish I'd done was gone to more talks like this to really kind of see what was out there, because apart from investment banking, which I knew I didn't want to do because I was afraid of the hours, I just kind of thought, okay, well then finance isn't for me, and sort of wrote it off. But because I was thinking about law school, a family friend who was at Brooklyn Law and had worked at Morgan Stanley in a due diligence and compliance role kind of recommended that I look into this, put me in touch with her former boss who I interviewed with. And he was like, basically like, was very impressed by the fact that I'd gone to Wellesley, and was like, you're hired on the spot. And this was in January of 2013. So again, I just kind of finished school, didn't really know what I did. And so I found myself in this due diligence role doing essentially background checks on corporate clients. And through that, I had to read through a lot of cases, because basically with all the regulations and increased risk of money laundering and such, a lot of banks are kind of building out these departments. And I read through a lot of cases and regulatory filings, and quickly realized that I was not that passionate about the law. And I also kind of through that was networking with other lawyers who also were sort of like, make sure you're really sure that you want to do this before you spend 3 years and over $200,000 on law school. So I thought, I'm still young. I still want to kind of see what else is out there. I'm at Morgan Stanley, and, maybe there's something else that I can do within the bank. But I also kind of was in a pretty cushy 9-to-5 job that allowed a lot of free time. So I'm thinking, okay, I need to get more involved. I need to fill my time. And so I went to a Wellesley event in the city. It was through the New York Wellesley Club, and it was on volunteering. And while I'm at this volunteering event, I met this wonderful Wellesley alum who, as I was kind of expressing my desire, my kind of feeling a little bit like I needed to find something else, wasn't sure about law, whatever, she said, "Oh, you're at Morgan Stanley? My bankers are at Morgan Stanley. I have a lot of money there. Let me put you in touch with them." And she kind of just from that connect, and I wasn't really sure kind of what would come of it or not, but I thought, that's a very nice offer. I'm always happy to speak, especially since I'm at the firm. So of course I followed up with her, thanked her. She put me in touch with her, with the private wealth management group that managed her money. And initially I spoke with a young guy on their team. Then I met with a couple of the partners, and kind of through all my conversations, I learned, okay, this is what wealth management is, kind of figured out what skills I need to do, or what skills like are involved, and kind of how to position myself that this was something I wanted to pursue. And I wrote them all thank you notes, and they were so impressed by my thank you note that they actually ended up printing it out and sharing it with another team, because as it turned out, they were not hiring or looking to add a junior person, but their friends down the hall who had their own group were looking to hire. So they were so impressed by my thank you note that they called me up and said, hey, we want to interview you, put me in touch with the hiring manager, then kind of initiated a more formal interview process, which involved, I want to say, 3 interviews with like various people, putting together a business plan, a little bit of a logic test that was like online, and then going through a training program. And then as soon as I started, the first thing you have to do is get licensed. So I had to take my Series 7, my Series 66, and they basically said, okay, you have a month to get licensed. And if you have to pass the 7. If you fail, then you're fired. The 66, you get 2 shots, but it's easier. So you have 2 weeks to study. So kind of hit the ground running for just studying for those. And again, like I think they subsidized like a prep class, which I took for a week, and was this very kind of crash course, quick introduction to like, this is everything that could possibly happen in like finance. But it was great because I'd never had any of that formal kind of training at Wellesley. And then when I started at Morgan Stanley after I was licensed, I was in what's called a training program that's called the Wealth Advisory Associate Program. And it's a financial financial planning program. So you go through this for 18 months. And then after that, you kind of graduate, or I guess it was shorter than that. It was 12 months. And then you graduate and go into your financial advisor associate training program, where then kind of you're really on the clock and you're meant to be bringing in clients. And it's very much, you learn you learn on the job. You kind of, it's a quick introduction into the markets, trading, building portfolios, asset management, sales, because you're also meant to be bringing in business. It's client facing. You have to know what's going on kind of on a day-to-day basis, but you also are looking over the long term, over a long horizon. So there's a lot of risk management. And what I loved most about that was the relationship aspect. And while I was in my financial planning training program, one day I was on my way home, I was living at home, and I met this man standing at the bus stop, and he was wearing a Harvard hat. And I said, oh, I went to Wellesley. And he's like, oh, my best friend went to Wellesley. And, and I kind of have my financial advisor hat on. We started talking about the markets. We started talking in general, ended up like meeting later for coffee and building this relationship over like 6 months. And when my time to bring in new business kind of clicked on, one day, fortuitously within the first month of, oh my God, I have to bring in X amount of client assets, I get this call from him out of the blue saying, I have a friend who I want to refer to you. You know, it's an account. I'm not sure if it's big enough for you. It's only $8 million. Like, can you take this client off my hands? And it was just one of these moments where it's like, I'm so lucky, but also having kind of built this relationship over many months. And again, I wrote him thank you notes. And I think one of the themes throughout my career is relationships are so critical. I mean, obviously we're in investor relations now, but I think people forget the human element. So, and also the power of a handwritten thank you note in today's day and age is like, it goes such a long way. And the power, that's kind of where the Wellesley, I think, liberal arts education really can come through, and really, because another key is obviously communication skills and being able to write. And you'd be surprised how many people cannot communicate as effectively as most of the people I know from Wellesley can. And it also can be a differentiator, which I've certainly found. So I really enjoyed working in wealth management, really enjoyed kind of advising clients and really helping them meet their financial goals, and learning about a lot of different areas of finance, just not only like the day-to-day trading and portfolio management, but also about insurance, about taxes, about trusts and education planning. So you touch all of these different areas, which are also really important for our own financial well-being and knowledge, which I think people often neglect. And it's just kind of, it should be like your daily health routine kind of thing. Like, you need to know about it, because that leads to like being financially independent is so important, especially for women, and feeling confident. And I think the other big takeaway from wealth management is you never 100% know, like nobody knows what the market's going to do. So you can't try and time it. You can't really do any of that. You just have to have conviction you have to put together a plan, you have to do your research, and you have to have conviction in your ideas, but you also have to trust that there are going to be things like a global pandemic that you can't control. So all that, after a while, I really enjoyed kind of working in wealth management, but there's a lot of pressure. It is a sales job at the end of the day, because you have to be bringing in business. You have to constantly be kind of pounding the pavement. I was working a ton. That's another thing I should add, like wealth management is certainly better hours than traditional, than investment banking and other areas of finance, but you're still, going to be putting in 12-hour days most likely. And you're always kind of on. So I got an email from a headhunter about this opening at Lindsay Goldberg, which is a private equity firm where I work now. And it was to join their investor relations team. So I joined in April of 2017, and that's where I work now. And a lot of the same kind of relationship skills and communication skills have certainly crossed over very nicely. And one thing that I like now is most of our clients, most of our investors, we call limited partners, are institutional investors as opposed to retail investors, otherwise known as like family and individuals. So that comes with generally speaking, a higher level of sophistication, which also kind of can create more work and more formal processes that you have to go through and navigate. But I really enjoy that aspect, and there's a little bit less pressure. And in terms of like, I'm not managing my parents' money or, that kind of feeling, which I always had. And of course, we're still managing pensions and endowments, as Tasha was saying. So you are still responsible and have to be a fiduciary. But it's a little bit less of an emotional connection. And in my role now, kind of meet with clients, do a lot of, we do some fundraising. We're raising our 5th fund right now. It has a target of $4 billion. So raising that should be closing in June. We do some existing client management. We have 4 funds already. And I also am responsible for ESG. That's our environmental social governance program. So happy to speak to that. So sorry, long-winded way, but just to kind of show a lot of my career has been based on networking and trying to just build connections and going from there.
I love hearing both of your stories. Actually, since you mentioned ESG, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So ESG has become increasingly important in kind of all areas of finance now, but it's essentially looking at these factors that we believe if you manage properly will lead to better financial performance. So ESG has certainly kind of evolved. Initially, it started as a kind of movement to divest certain things. So you might have heard, pension plans divesting from tobacco or oil and gas, and some are still doing that. But now it's really kind of looking at incorporating these, or I should say, things have shifted more into less so divestment and more how are companies managing these factors. So how are they kind of thinking about both risks and opportunities that their companies and business operations may face with respect to factors related to the environment. So things like carbon emissions, water pollution, resource depletion. Do you have facilities in a flood zone? Are you at risk for, now with increased climate variability, how does that impact your business operations? Does it create liabilities that we could try and quantify in terms of trying to figure out what financial impact, if this disaster were to come to fruition, would have on our business? and does it also prevent opportunities? So can we install some types of renewable energy? Can we employ renewable energy to kind of offset those costs and better prepare for the future? On the social side, worker health and safety is huge, because not only is it bad publicity if you've got workers who are getting injured, and it's also bad for production and governance. And now, of course, with COVID-19, you know, what type of paid leave policies does your company offer? And so people really, there's now kind of an increasing credence to this idea that if you manage these factors well, that it will lead to better financial performance and better long-term, more durable, sustainable businesses. So happy to talk more about that at any point, but that's kind of a high level, and they're moving toward trying to increase standardization across the industry, but that still is a work in progress. The UN Principles for Responsible Investing came out with some frameworks, and there's climate related frameworks, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail, but kind of in terms of how Lindsay Goldberg approaches it, we just try and make sure that we're monitoring these material factors across our portfolio and across our businesses.
So that's by the way, an interesting topic that seems to catch a lot of attention at Wellesley. The idea of sustainable social impact, impact investing, ESG. So we've been trying to talk about it more and more throughout programming. So question, as you reflect on your career so far, what would you say is the biggest surprise that you kind of look back and go, wow, or just kind of shocks you about your own career? Tasha, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I feel like I can answer this in so many different ways, so I'll give you two. One, I'm honestly surprised at how much, on a you know, joking note, I'm surprised at how much I'm able to work, because, you know, there was a moment in time when I was in banking and I pulled 36 hours in a row at the office over a weekend, and that was after working till 3 a.m. every day leading up to that weekend. And somehow was totally fine after that. And not saying that that's, you know, something to be proud of, but it's definitely something that definitely surprised me. I always thought I needed like 8 hours of sleep at night. Apparently that is not true. But, you know, on a serious note, I'm surprised at how many things I've kind of jumped through. You know, I was always kind of averse to thinking about like, oh, let me spend 2 years here, let me spend 2 years there, and let me make that leap. And, you know, I was kind of brought up with like, you stay loyal to one place, you kind of just work there. And to come into the corporate world at this point in time, I think it's rare to find a place that, you know, you are super in love with off the bat and you want to stay there for the rest of your career. And I think what really surprised me was being very flexible about, hey, this is what I want out of my career right now, and it may not necessarily be for the long term, but it's something I want to pursue and something I should look into, and sort of taking that leap and knowing that it'll be okay. And it sounds so cheesy, right? It's so easy for me to say this like 4 jobs out of college. And, you know, I think at that moment when I'm trying to make that decision to make that jump, it's not the easiest, it's not the most straightforward, but ultimately you sort of know yourself the best. And if you felt like at that moment that was what you wanted to do, which for me was, then it made sense. And looking back now, I wouldn't have done anything different about my career. I wouldn't, you know, there was a point where I thought, do I want to go to business school? And I feel like at Wellesley too, there's such a rat race of expectations to some degree, you know, like you're obviously all very smart. You know, a lot of you want careers in finance or are interested in careers in finance, but, you know, you're also probably being exposed to the same types of conversations that I was exposed to amongst my peers. You know, let me get this job, let me do this, and everything was very structured and everything felt like you were on some sort of competition even no matter how friendly, it's still stressful. And I remember a big point for me was, business school, and a lot of my friends being like, are you not applying to Harvard? Are you not applying to like all these top 5 business schools? And business school was not something that I wanted to do. And that was something I thought I wanted when I graduated from Wellesley. And it's definitely something that took me by surprise to wanting to stay in the workforce and opting to not go to business school. So I'm also happy to talk about those decisions as well. Not to say that, I would never consider going to business school, but, when taking my career into account and thinking about where I want to end up and thinking about the skills that I'm trying to build, it just made more sense for me to stay out of business school and continue working. And it's surprised me at how okay I've been with that. And, you can still have a good career, a career that gives you fulfillment and challenges you without feeling the pressure to go back to school. But yeah, I would say, all the above.
Elizabeth, you want to take it now?
Yeah, so I think I totally agree with Tasha in that I think so one thing I was reflecting on is that I am surprised by how there are certain biases that still do really exist, especially in finance, against women, in the sense of I've seen more often than not women getting stuck with the bookbinding at the last minute, or the more administrative things like carrying books to meetings, handling all the printing and setting up the call and that sort of thing. And yes, we tend to be, as a stereotype, more organized and more on it, but you don't usually see the partners kind of asking the guys to do that. And so I think what's been surprising is how, and part of it, and I'm guilty of this, is women tend to say yes a lot and don't always push back, and maybe are afraid to push back. And I remember this very distinctly when I first joined the team that I was working with at Morgan Stanley. There was my kind of male counterpart analyst who I was working very closely with. I would get asked to do certain things that he wouldn't, in terms of, again, like more admin related, like bookbinding and that kind of thing, or kind of a more, not related to my job or his job. And he would just, at a certain point, just kind of said no, or would just leave. And I never, ever in a million years would think to do that. But at the end of the day, I think, I was worse off for having done those things, because then I put the work that I really needed to do on the back burner. And so I think, just as a general tip, like sometimes it's okay to not always say yes and not try and do everything, because you don't want to burn out, and you have to put yourself first. And I think you have to work hard for sure, but also work smarter, not necessarily longer, and try to, and obviously this takes time and experience, but try to become discerning about which projects are really going to help your career and add value, and be strategic about the projects and the work that you accept, because it's not always in your best interest to say yes to everything. In fact, it can often hurt you, and just, you'll be working a lot. So just be mindful about the work that you take on, and be aware that these biases do exist. And I do think that, like, often when work gets kind of put on the woman because they know that she'll do it, especially a Wellesley woman who's just going to put her head down and work, because that's kind of what we're trained to do in school. But try and adopt more of a leader mindset of, like, is this really worth my time? Value your time, I guess, is a big takeaway. But of course, still be humble and willing to do work, and if something needs to get done, then it just needs to get done. But make sure you're not sacrificing your own well-being or health to do something, especially if it's not critical.
I would add one more thing to that. I think Bitsy is totally right. A lot of times, like, it's unfortunate. I think it's more jarring to Wellesley women, right? That like you're being subjected to a lot of these sort of more assistant S type roles. And there's nothing wrong if you want to be an assistant, awesome, be an assistant. But if you sign up to do a certain job and that's not really part of that description, it does happen a lot more than you think, and not just to me. It's a lot across a lot of other really strong independent professional women that I know, my peers as well. And so it is sort of an industry thing. It does feel very boys club-y at times, and that is sometimes surprising. It's jarring. You come from Wellesley, which is the most supportive, nurturing environment in the world, and you have that built-in support system, and you have your friends and your professors and your deans, and you have Hilda. But in the real world, it's a little tough. And honestly, sometimes it's really on you to find your support groups and mentors and sponsors. And there's a difference between being a mentor and being a sponsor, which we can get into more later. But it is super crucial that, on top of prioritizing your career and whatnot and doing a really good job at work, you should also try to seek out people who will vouch for you and who will support you and who have your back. I think it's surprising a lot of women sometimes may not necessarily find that off the bat, and it creates, not to say that all places in finance are like that. There are some places with amazing culture and there's some places with not so amazing culture, and that is not specific to finance. That's unfortunately, the world at large. But in finance, especially because there aren't maybe as many women, it can sometimes feel a little, I would say, more on like the lonely side, if for whatever reason, right, you just maybe are not confident enough and you want to push back, but you don't necessarily have that voice, and it's a little jarring to like get a request, and you want to do well and you want to placate and you want to be all those things. But it's important, to Bitsy's point, to realize sort of your own limits, being able to advocate for yourself, and ultimately finding a support system that will help advocate for you in the events that you can't advocate for yourself either.
You guys have touched upon so many key things that are so real. It's real life, coming at you when you're not there yet. And I think it's really incredible that you're talking about it and the way that you're describing and how you're empowering them to think about it. So I really appreciate that, because that's definitely completely unscripted. So why don't we do something? We have about 10 minutes left. How about if we open it up for those of you that are in the silent mode? If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead. I think you can, and if you can't, you can tell me. Or you can, if you have questions that you've been thinking about that you want to ask them, and remember, it's ask me anything kind of a thing format, so you can ask anything you want. But I thought I would open it up and give them an opportunity. Okay, so Roxy, why don't we unmute you? Go for it.
Hi. So I just had a quick question. Both of you mentioned that networking was really, really important in both of your career trajectories. So I was wondering, do you guys have any tips on how to follow up with the people that you've met in your networks and how to establish more of these long-term connections instead of just like a one-time informational call?
I feel like Bitsy is the expert at it. So I'm gonna let Bitsy take that one first.
I think that's a great question, because it is really important, to Tasha's point, to keep these networks, to keep your connections, because you never know when someone will pop up. So I love holidays. Like, that is such an easy touch point. For me, like, I'm still in touch with my clients from Morgan Stanley, and I always send birthday cards and Father's Day notes and other, events where they're gonna, people are busy. So that's another kind of piece of advice. While I think our writing style at Wellesley is a differentiator and something that you should definitely use to your advantage, because a lot of people can't articulate themselves or write as eloquently as most Wellesley women can. Still be direct, be clear, concise, be humble, be persistent, because don't take things personally. People are very busy, especially now in this environment where your inbox is just getting flooded. Yes, people can have a little more flexibility in terms of setting up a call and a virtual session than they might have if they were stuck at the office, but they're still getting tons of emails because everything pretty much is an email right now. So I would just kind of drop a note, just say, oh, articles too. Like I am constantly sharing things, which again is, you have to be careful you don't want to like spam people, but if you had talked about something, so I'll give you an example. Met a woman at a women's in alternatives conference, and we sat next to each other at lunch and kind of built a rapport. And I sent her a note after. She kind of wrote back, yeah, we should stay in touch. And then a couple months later, I saw a headline in the news about like something that we had spoken about. And I said, oh, I was just thinking of you, was reminded of our conversation. And she wrote back immediately and was like, so great to hear from you. And then I was able to kind of parlay that into a due diligence meeting on our fund. Obviously this is like, 3 calls later, but still you never know kind of when it might be a good time to follow up or check in with someone. So you want to be authentic about it. But I think any kind of touch point that you can kind of use as a again, like if you're genuine about it, I think people will be really receptive. Kind of like just any friendship, how you would think of a friend or a family member. Maybe you don't speak to all the time.
That's a good point, though. Keeping it very much genuine is probably the best way to go. Okay, I'm going to let Ms. Rivera, I think I've unmuted you.
Yeah.
Great.
Hi, thanks so much, Tasha and Lizzie, for sharing your experiences. I'm actually a Wellesley alum too. I just joined because I was like, why not? And I'm also interested in finance. I actually didn't study econ. I studied policy and Africana studies, and I thought that I wanted to do development work. And 1 year into my fellowship, I was like, maybe this isn't for me, and I want to try something different. I spoke to a couple of my friends who are in banking and consulting, and I started doing a couple of prep on finance and found that that's what my interest was. So I think my question for you guys is for some of us who obviously are like past the recruitment cycle and all that, but are still really interested in kind of getting our foot in the door. What's a good place to start in terms of, like self-taught material, whether it's like taking courses on Coursera or you mentioned Excel, stuff like that. Like what's a good place to start for a good foundation so that even as I'm speaking to finance professionals, I can be like, hey, yeah, my background is very non-traditional, but like, here's what I've done to demonstrate my interest.
That's actually a very interesting question. I would say, it's funny, I've actually never heard of Coursera. I feel like I'm so technologically not savant, but so I actually got my CAIA, which is the Chartered Alternatives Investment Advisor. So if you're not familiar, it's like another sort of certification that is similar to a CFA, but way easier.
Okay.
At least in my mind, it's a lot easier. It's very focused, obviously, because that's a more alternatives focused coursework, I would say. But, you can study on your own. You just get the textbook. And I don't think the exam is anything a Wellesley alum would not be able to handle. Like, there is very minimal math, which I know is like a sore point for a lot of liberal arts folks. But that one's a great one. And I actually also am like in the middle of taking my CFA. I feel like, off the bat, those sort of strike me as, really, really convincing or sources of interest or indications of interest, I would say, with folks. If they see you have a charter, you're obviously serious about a career in finance, but also a lot of the materials, aren't really, a lot of the CFA might be very tough and the CAIA again might be easier, but the materials really aren't written for, you need to have taken XYZ years in finance to be able to like pass and get these certifications. It's really, if you have a finance career and you have, that's your day-to-day, it's obviously a lot easier for you to get those charters. But ultimately, I think if you, did study on your own and I know the Kaya, you do it twice a year, March and September, and the CFA for the first level, you do it twice a year. If you fail once, you can take it again. And then, level 2, level 3 are once a year. So it does take some time, but it is definitely like a great way. I know that a lot of people, they see the CFA, they're like, oh, very serious finance person off the bat. And, ultimately, I would say, definitely use the Wellesley network. I know there might not be a ton of Wellesley alums on, I guess, I don't know what the platform is now, Handshake or Hive. On Hive, I know there may not be a ton of them, and some of them might not respond, given if they're super busy and whatnot. But I think it is also very important. Like an example I had a Wellesley first year reach out to me on LinkedIn. Randomly, and she had no finance experience whatsoever. Not that you have to have experience at that point because you're so young, but she said that she wanted a career in investment banking or to try it out. And so she reached out to me because I'm not active on any of these Hive, on the Hive and whatnot, and I put her in touch with other people who I knew in the industry. And so networking is a big part of it, especially if you're not coming from like a traditional path. There are a lot more openings than you think, and there are a lot other different opportunities than you think, other than just the banking, the sales and trading, even on the asset management side, right? Like Bitsy was saying she was doing some stuff with ESG. Like I know at Goldman, there's a whole team dedicated to, ESG and policy and implementation and dealing with clients. And there are some funds that are dealing with impact investing. And so there are ways, as long as you have a concrete story of how you want to pivot from development into finance and like really, really fine tune that story that makes sense and it's ironclad, I don't necessarily see you having a problem, especially if you, do show that you're like, people will test you in the interview, if they want to test you on financial stuff. Not all finance interviews are the same. You're not maybe expected to know it off the bat. And some people have like rotational programs. So those are more introductory. But ultimately, I think, if you can maybe get a certification, get a certification. If you can take an Excel course, take an Excel course. Ultimately, I think what is the most important is getting your story straight and having everything else to supplement that and, really, really harness the networking aspect of it. It's sort of all plays on each other. I'm not sure that was maybe the best, most linear answer, but, I'm happy for you to get my email and you can reach out and we can try to see if there are people we can connect you to.
Definitely. Thank you.
I would also add, like, to Tasha's point, like, definitely reach out to alums, but also try and do your homework before you reach out to them. So, for instance, I had a Wellesley alum who reached out to me when I was at Morgan Stanley, and it turned out, and I suspected this was the case, was interested in an investment banking internship at Morgan Stanley, and I was in wealth management, and I'm happy to speak to her and explain kind of like about wealth management, but it's not really the best use of her time or my time to go through like a completely separate division. And as Tasha said, like, I'm happy to put her in touch with people I know in banking, but it's just one of those things where like these are big banks or big institutions that have a lot of different divisions. And so yes, there's a good chance that we'll know someone, but like be a little bit targeted in your outreach. So as to kind of make the best use of everyone's time and also kind of hone in on like which areas of finance you might be more interested in. I would also put a plug in for Forte, which is an organization kind of dedicated to getting more women in finance, and they have tons of webinars and prep programs and things like that are really, it's very helpful and geared toward women. I would also kind of, in addition to Coursera, like maybe consider, if you can afford it, taking a class for credit if you're worried about your quant skills or want to demonstrate your quantitative aptitude or you're interested in finance. Like, I don't know how much banks or other places will really care about that, but I don't think it could hurt just from a personal development standpoint. And then if you're thinking about applying to business school at some point, if you take it for credit, they tend to look at that more favorably than if you just took it not for free or not for credit. And then another book that I would recommend if you're thinking about consulting, because I feel like you mentioned that, is Case in Point. And that's like a case study interview question prep book that is tremendously helpful. So there are definitely books and resources out there, and also happy to kind of connect after, but hopefully that helps.
I was going to also say, I know Bitsy was talking about taking like the Series 7 and 66, which, if folks aren't familiar, they are regulatory exams that you would need as a salesperson or a registered advisor to be selling financial product. A lot of the time, a lot of roles in finance do require that, but as I just found out, because I had to retake my 7 for this new job, they have actually split the 7 into 2 parts. So it's now the SIE and then the 7, which is a less daunting exam. So the difference between the two is the SIE is more basic, and it gives you sort of like a practical download. So like, the finance theory classes in Wellesley will only teach you so much. And sometimes, like, I don't even really remember what I learned in finance theory at Wellesley, to be quite honest. But in the book, not to say that it wasn't great, it was great. But the SIE does give you the lay of the land for the basic financial stuff you need, options, how to calc options, just things like that. And everyone can take it without a financial sponsor. For the 7, for the 66, and all these other things, you do need a financial employer to help sponsor you. But the SIE is trying to be more accessible to a lot of folks. So I think that's also a really great way to indicate interest if you have the SIE and you've shown that you've passed it. It's quite, from what I remember, the textbook that I got, it's very straightforward, nothing like tricky about it. It's just very basic, fundamental. This is finance. This is, various strategies. This is a different asset class. What is a bond? Different layers of debt. Basic things like that, which should help a lot, give you a foundation that you would need to speak intelligently, at least in the community.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. Thank you so much.
So ladies, I can't thank you enough. Our time has come to an end. Thank you, Tasha. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you guys for joining us. I will most certainly follow up with you guys. If you are open, I'm happy to share your email with them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.